something shared. I mean, a few years back, there was an article in Times, and of course, it keeps on coming, and we were wanting about the origin of universe and etc. And I think the physicist who described how it all happened, and he said there must be a very superior intelligence behind it all, and religious people will probably think that is God, but he didn't say himself that is God. So you seem to be there. There seems to be a glass ceiling beyond which that intellect doesn't seem to go to appreciate that final. That is indeed the God.
As for the physicists and their reluctance to say that God exists, well, there is a distinction between science and faith. And the distinction seems to be this. I think you put it right way. There's a glass ceiling beyond which science cannot make any claims. And if a scientist makes a claim beyond that ceiling, well, then he is claiming something outside of his field of expertise. Science requires evidence and proof of a physical nature. And when we speak of God, we're not speaking of something or someone physical. We're speaking of someone metaphysical. And because we're speaking of someone metaphysical, we're speaking outside here of the scientific domain. A scientist cannot claim to have any expertise to declare anything about God, because God is not something you can study in a science lab. You can study the effects of God, the creation of God, and so on. But you cannot study God directly as a matter of science. So scientists can make claims about the early stages of the universe, for example, but they cannot go beyond that and say who created the universe. This is a matter for philosophy and for faith. And sometimes some scientists make claims about God, but we should be sure that they're speaking outside of their field of expertise. They do not have any reason to make such claims. Mm-hmm.
Okay, Jazakallah khair. A question from the sister side. From an Islamic point of view, can the causation and design argument be used to prove the existence of God?
From an Islamic point of view, obviously, we believe that God exists. And we don't believe that based on any of these proofs. That is a faith that is innate to us. And we believe that God created us with that faith. وَفَأَلْهَمَهَا فُجُورَهَا وَتَقْوَاهَا. God has inspired us with this right belief and the ability to distinguish between right and wrong. And that faith is further confirmed in the believer by our worship. When a believer worships Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the believer feels close to Allah, personally close. And one does not need any of these arguments. At the same time, we can use these arguments against those who are asking for argument and proof. If somebody says, prove to me that God exists. Well, we can ask him as well, you prove to me that God does not exist. Because it works both ways. Why should the believer have the burden of proof in this case? In fact, it is the non-believer that should prove his case. See, suppose you have a friend, and I don't believe you have that friend. And you might say to me, well, I don't have to prove to you my friend exists. What does it matter? I have my friend, I'm happy with my friend, and I don't have to prove anything to you. You don't have my friend, and too bad for you. You don't have a friend like my friend. But I don't have to prove to you that my friend exists. Why should I have to go through the trouble to prove that to you? That's your loss, that you don't have a friend like my friend. Okay? So, but if he says, no, your friend does not exist, you say, man, you're crazy. I know my friend, and you're telling me my friend does not exist? He says, no, it's all in your mind. And you say, okay, prove to me it's all in my mind. So now you can put the question to him. He should prove that your friend does not exist. So in a similar way, we can ask the atheist honestly, what proof do you have that God does not exist? Usually atheists pride themselves in going by evidence and proof. So here they're making a claim. So that claim requires some substantiation as well. On what basis do they claim that God does not exist? If I say that Sheikh Abu Muntasir is not here, then it means that I'm probably looking around and I don't see him around. But how do I know he's not in the next room? I have to go examine the next room. How do I know he's not using a washroom down in the basement somewhere? So I have to go down to the lower floor and check every washroom with permission after, calling out and so on and make sure nobody's coughing from inside. I have to check everywhere. So without checking everywhere, how do I know that Sheikh Abu Muntasir is not here? So if somebody says God does not exist, where has he checked? Where has he looked? And we are not saying that God is like a part of the universe. So you check, the protons, you check the electrons, you check the neutrons, and then you say God is neither in the proton or in the electron or in the neutron. God is a separate existence. He's in a metaphysical plane, not in the physical plane. So it's even beyond the realm of science to prove that God does not exist. So in the end, the atheist believes in something that he cannot prove and has not proven. Does the believer have some substantiation for the belief that he has? First of all, the belief is in it. Second, we experience the substantiation of that belief in our worship. A person makes Hajj and he is sure that he's in the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. A person is reading the Quran and he has the distinct experience that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is speaking to him. You see a brother weeping during the Taraweeh prayers. He feels very close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And you wonder what he's weeping about. I was in a masjid and a kid asked his father, "Why is that guy weeping?" He said, "Because that guy has a lot of sins." So, but the reality is that, a lot of sins or a little bit of sins, the person feels close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that whole experience of feeling close to Allah azza wa jal, that's what makes the person weep at that moment. So now, and then the believer receives further confirmation of his belief from these arguments that we're mentioning, the cosmological, the teleological argument, and so on. So the believer is on good rational grounds for believing that God exists, because it's innate to us. Second, we experience that in our worship. And third, there are philosophical arguments that back us up. What does the atheist have for his view? Nothing, really.
Our final question from the brother here.
My question is about the first cause argument that you mentioned earlier, in that you said that we need an explanation in that argument. When we are talking to atheists, they say that they don't need to explain the first cause other than the universe itself. So if you can explain through an agent which is God that created the universe, then we have to go to the infinite causes scenario. So why not just stop at universe itself?
Okay. So the question, as I understand it in a nutshell, is when I said that the atheists are trying to explain the universe, and I'm positing that the universe needs to have an explanation. Why do we need to go there? Why do we not stop at the universe itself as an explanation for itself, right? That's the thing. Okay. Imam al-Juwayni, the teacher of the famous Imam al-Ghazali, rahimahullah, spoke about what things being either contingent or non-contingent. So let's explain what's meant by contingent and non-contingent. You know, when somebody says, I have a contingency plan, what does it mean? It means they have an alternative plan, right? So if this plan A doesn't work out, I have a plan B, okay? So you have a plan A, you have a plan B, because you're dealing now with, you have your contingency plan. You're hoping for A, but B could result as well. So if two things can result, either A or B, and let's say A is the result, then there is a reason why A is the result but not B, right? There is an explanation. We may not know the explanation, but you bet that there is one. There is some trigger that made it go to A and not to B. If it was only A, if it can only be A, there is no explanation for why it is only A, right? It's just only A. We ask your brother, why is it A? Well, because nothing else. It has to be A, right? Okay, that's when we're dealing with a non-contingent thing. Okay, so let's think of believers believing in God. When you ask a believer, who created God? The believer will say, well, what do you mean who created God? God is the uncreated creator of everything else. God, it may not be a fact, but that's your belief, right? But whether it's true or not, that is your belief. That's the belief of the believer, that God is the uncreated creator of the universe. So once a believer believes that, it's pointless to ask the believer, well, who created your uncreated creator? The question itself doesn't make sense. True? Now, the scientist. Does the scientist believe that the universe is an uncreated being that just simply exists by itself? No. The distinction is between the contingent thing, the thing that exists contingently, and the thing that exists necessarily. I think this is more to the point. Let me start here. I'm starting all over. For the believer, God necessarily exists. And the believer cannot conceive of God not existing. That is an impossibility. God not existing, that would not be God. Saint Anselm of Canterbury came up with a definition for God, that God is that beyond which nothing greater can be conceived. And that became part of what is known as the ontological argument for the existence of God. So I'm not considering the whole argument now called the ontological argument, but I'm concerned only with this definition of God, that God is that beyond which nothing greater can be conceived. So to understand that definition, suppose you think of God as being so great. Now, if you can think of someone that is greater than this God you're thinking about at the moment, then obviously that greater one should be God. He's more deserving of being called God, right? So if you're thinking of a God who may or may not exist, what is greater? That God who may or may not exist, or the God who necessarily and definitely exists, no question asked? Which one? The one who may or may not exist, or the one who definitely exists? The one who definitely exists is greater, right? So the one that we are considering to be God, that is the one beyond which nothing greater can be conceived, and that is the one who necessarily exists. And it's unconceivable that he does not exist. So now for the believer, when we ask you about this God who necessarily exists, why does he exist? You say just simply he exists. There's no reason or explanation or cause for this, because we believe he is a necessary existence. Okay, so the universe, is that like a God who necessarily exists, or is that a contingent existence that scientists are searching for an explanation for? It's obviously the latter, right? They're searching for an explanation because they think it could have come this way or that way or through this cause or through that cause. They don't know what cause it is. So for them, the universe is a contingent existence. So when you're dealing with a contingent existence, I think can either go A or B, either the main plan or the plan B, the contingency plan. Either this or that could happen. You need to know what the explanation is. Okay, you may not know what the explanation is, you may not even care, but you are dealing here with a contingent existence. And if you're dealing with a contingent existence, you can be sure that there is an explanation for why it exists. Whether you know the explanation, whether you care about it or not. But in the case of the necessary being, there's no explanation, because that being just simply exists and there's nothing more to ask. Now, if the scientist is saying, well, the universe too exists and we're not going to ask any more questions, he's not doing science. Because he's dealing here with something which by definition is contingent, and he's just refusing to ask the question. It's like, the professor asking his student, why does the water boil at a certain temperature? And the student says, well, it just boils. Okay? There is an explanation, even if he doesn't bother to do his homework and find out the answer. Okay? Shukran.
Jazakallah khair.